All right, so welcome to the next lecture for Introduction to Psychology. This is going to be a very long lecture, so we're going to just go straight through, and I'll try to give us examples, but not too many examples on each slide. Okay, as always, this is published by Flat World for you all. And the chapter we're covering today is Chapter 3, Biological Psychology, the Brain at Work. Um, This takes me back to a course that I took in biological psychology, so it was a full 16-week course just in this one chapter. We got into depth in a lot of the processes in biological psychology. But what we're going to do here today is just going to highlight what biological psychology is. Okay. So the body is controlled by an information highway known as the nervous system. And the nervous system, think of this as the body's superfast internet connection. It's a collection of hundreds of billions of specialized cells that send messages between different parts of the body. These messages tell your body what to do, like move your hand or remember a fact. It's broken down into the central nervous system, and this part is the main office of the nervous system. It includes the brain, the spinal cord. It's the boss, right? It's the brain boss. It makes decisions. It controls everything. While the spinal cord is the other part of the central nervous system, is like the main highway that sends messages between the brain and the rest of the body. And then we continue with the peripheral nervous system. These are the smaller roads that connect the main highway, the spinal cord, to the rest of your body. So they link the central nervous system to your skin, your muscles, glands. It helps you feel things. It helps you move, and even helps you sweat. There is a behavior that's influenced by the endocrine system. Right? So what is the endocrine system? Imagine this as a team of chemical messengers. It's the body's chemical regulator and consists of glands that release hormones. And hormones are like little chemical messages that travel through your body to different parts of your body. It tells them what to do and when to do it. It affects things like growth, metabolism, and mood. And mood is what we're especially interested in this course. So the learning objectives for this section, 3.1, the first section, is to describe the structure and functions of the neuron. You might remember this from some of your biology classes. Draw a diagram of the pathways of communication within and between neurons. List the 7 major neurotransmitters and describe their functions. And explain how agonists, antagonists, reuptake inhibitors, and enzyme inhibitors work. Let's get started. All right, so biological psychology. So in biological psychology, the course I took, is a long course, we learned that neurons are very important for understanding how our body and brain communicates. You have to know things like what is a neuron, right? Down to the basic what the cell is. So it's a special type of cell in the nervous system. Its job is to receive and send information. You can think of neurons like tiny messengers that carry signals all around the body. We have sensory neurons. These neurons send signals from different parts of your body to your brain. For example, if you touch something hot, sensory neurons carry the message to your brain, and that says, this is hot. Right? We have motor neurons, kind of like what they sound like. These neurons send signals from your brain to the muscles. For example, when you decide to move your hand away from something hot, motor neurons carry the message from your brain to your hands that make them move. We also have something called interneurons, and these neurons connect sensory neurons and motor neurons. They help sensory and motor neurons talk to each other. So for example, when sensory neurons tell your brain that something is hot, interneurons help process that information and send a message to the motor neurons to move your hand away quickly. So if we summarize all this, neurons are cells that send and receive signals in your body that help you react to the world around you. That's it. I'm thinking right now that there might be a parallel to our nervous system structure and to the IP protocol structure for networking. But I haven't actually made a comparison, but I will. All right. Let's break down the major parts of a neuron as we see here in this diagram. So we have what are called dendrites. These are the little branches sticking out from the neuron. They receive messages from other neurons and and pass them towards the cell body. The cell body is that big old area of the neuron itself, of the cell. So think of them like tiny little antennas that catch signals. The cell body, that's also called the soma. This is the main part of the neuron where the nucleus is located. It processes the messages received from the dendrites and decides whether to send a signal down that axon, that very long cable. We'll call it cable. Again, the nucleus, we said it's inside the soma. This is like the brain of the neuron. Again, it's found in the cell body. It controls the neuron's activities and it contains its genetic material or its DNA. The axon, which you mentioned, that's that long, thin fiber that carries messages away from the cell body to other neurons or muscles or glands. It's like a highway for electrical signals. Now, those things that look like little hot dogs, or I call them like little hot dog links, are called myelin sheaths. This is a fatty layer that covers the axon in segments. It acts like insulation on a wire, so it helps signals travel faster along the axon. And then we got those points in between those little hot dogs, and we call those nodes of Ranvier. These are small gaps in that myelin sheath along the axon, and they help speed up the transmission of signals by allowing them to jump from one node to the next. You have to know a little bit about capacitance to kind of understand how and why this works and why it moves so fast. Without it, you wouldn't move the signal wouldn't move very fast down the axon. And then we get to the very end, the axon terminals. These are the branches at the end of the axon. They release chemicals called neurotransmitters to send messages to other neurons or muscles or glands. So the neuron itself is like a messenger cell with dendrites receiving messages. The cell body processes those messages, and the axon sends them out to other parts of the body. I hope I'm making good time here. All right, the neuron is a building block of the nervous system continuum. So let's break it down. Let's break down the parts of a neuron and how they work in biological psychology. So again, starting off with the cell body, the soma. This is like the main hub or control center of the neuron. It contains the nucleus. We said it holds the neuron's DNA and keeps everything functioning properly. It's just like any other cell. The cell body processes, except for this cell body processes information, right? It receives information that it receives from the dendrites. But just like every other cell in your body, it's still a cell. Then we have the dendrite, right? Think of the dendrites like tiny branches or antennas that stick out from the cell body. They receive messages from other neurons and pass these messages to the cell body. The dendrites will help neurons communicate with each other by catching signals, basically. The axon, we said, is that long, thin fiber that carries messages away from the cell body to other neurons, muscles, or glands. We say it's like the highway for electrical signals. At the end of the axon, there are those axon terminals that send the messages to the next neuron in line. And in biological psychology, understanding these parts of the neuron helps us learn how our brain and nervous system communicate. So neurons work together to send and receive messages, and this allows us to think, to feel, to move. And it's interesting, I won't get into it in this lecture, but understanding something like seasonal affective disorder or SAD, which is a type of depression, can be traced back to the function of this cell. We'll get to that in a different chapter, but it's interesting to map these things out. Okay, let's look at two more important parts of a neuron and how they work in biological psychology. So I mentioned the hot dogs, right? The myelin sheath. So imagine the axon is like a long wire and myelin sheath is like this plastic coating around the wire. And it's made of a fatty material that wraps around the axon in segments. Not much like a real hot dog, but it's wrapped around. And so this myelin sheath helps protect the axon and makes the electrical signals travel faster and more efficiently, just like how insulation helps electricity move through wires safely and quickly. Right? Now, we're not talking about, in this case, electrons the way you would see electrons traveling through a wire. This is electrochemical, so it actually keeps that signal and that membrane potential intact so it can travel along the axon much faster. Axon terminals, these are the small branches at the very end of the axon, like we said before. So when an electrical signal travels down the axon, it reaches the axon terminals. And then the axon terminals release chemicals called neurotransmitters. And these chemicals cross this tiny gap, we call it a synapse, and it's a space, just a tiny space between neurons, and they deliver messages to the very next neuron, or maybe to a muscle fiber, or to a gland. So think of axon terminals like the mailman who delivers a letter, which is the message, to your mailbox, which is the next neuron, right? And biological psychology, understanding myelin sheath and axon terminals, this helps us learn how neurons communicate quickly, accurately. This communication is actually very essential for our bodies. So it helps us from everything from moving muscles to thinking and feeling. So I mentioned before that I was going to stress the behavioral, or also called psychomotor, which is like moving muscles or action and behavior. Cognitive, which we relate to thinking, and then affective domain, which we relate to feeling. So I said this in the last presentation, last recording: cognitive, affective, behavioral, or psychomotor, depending on how old of a textbook you're reading. Okay, now it says neurons communicate using electricity and chemicals. So communication is electrochemical. So let's break this down, see how it works, right? How neurons communicate. So inside a neuron, you have electricity in a way. It's a charge carrier, meaning there is something that has a charge, just like an electron, but this is in a chemical. So think of a neuron as a tiny little electrical device. Inside the neuron, communication happens using these electrical signals. So when a neuron gets a message, it creates an electrical pulse that travels down the axon, that long part of the neuron, like electricity running through a wire, except for in this case, it's not electrons that travel, like electrons travel through a wire. It's a charge carrier. And a charge carrier can be anything, anything that has a positive or negative charge. Right? So charge carriers, we usually refer to that as larger molecules that are polarized or have a charge, and they travel. So versus electricity running through wire, but it's the same concept. We still have the same potential, same current, things like that. Between the neurons, we have chemicals. So when the electrical signal reaches the end of the axon, it can't jump directly to the next neuron. Instead, it needs help from chemicals, other charge carriers. Right? So the end of the axon has these tiny sacs filled with chemicals called neurotransmitters. When the electrical signal reaches the end, these sacs release the neurotransmitters in a tiny gap between the neurons that we call a synapse. So the neurotransmitter, these little chemicals, they float across the synapse and they attach to special spots or receptors on the next neuron. And this starts a new electrical signal in the next neuron. And this happens actually extremely fast. So it's not slow by any means. So we summarize this whole process where you have electrical signals travel inside the neuron, chemical signals or neurotransmitters travel between neurons, and neurons communicate by passing electrical signals inside of themselves and using chemicals to pass messages to the next neuron. And this teamwork of electricity and chemicals helps our brain and body work together to do everything that we need, from, again, thinking, feeling, or moving and reacting. So cognitive, affective, and behavioral. I think we're doing all right on time. Those lines. All right, neurotransmitters, the body's chemical messengers, synapse, neurotransmitter, and reuptake. So let's go ahead and jump into these to dive a little further into each of these so you can actually understand them a little better. So the synapse, what is it? Let's imagine there's a tiny gap between two neurons, like a small bridge that the signals need to cross. And we call this gap the synapse. It's where the end of one neuron is very, very close to the beginning of the next neuron, but they don't actually touch. Then we have neurotransmitters. These are like little messengers that carry signals across the synapse. So when an electrical signal reaches the end of the neuron, it releases these neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters float across the synapse and attach to the next neuron to pass the message along. And then we have this concept called reuptake. So reuptake just means that after the neurotransmitters have delivered the message to the other neuron, they're like messengers who finish their job and they need to come back home. So instead of floating around forever and just hanging around in that space, they are taken back up into the original neuron. And we call this process reuptake. So it's like recycling the messengers so they can be used again when needed. Summarizing this whole thing, we have synapses, tiny gaps between neurons where messages are passed. Neurotransmitter, that's the actual chemical messenger that carries signals across the synapse. And we have reuptake, the process of taking back those neurotransmitters into the original neuron after they've delivered their message. I guess you can look at this as like the mailman, all of this in a way. So why is this important for biological psychology? It's important in understanding how synapses and neurotransmitters and reuptake work to help us learn how neurons communicate, and that actually shows how our brain controls everything we do. So imagine if we had a problem with reuptake and those neurotransmitters weren't being brought back to the original cell, or we weren't releasing enough messengers to send a signal to the next cell. Understanding all that will actually help us understand our own moods and behaviors. Okay, neurotransmitters, the body's chemical messengers. We're going to talk about action potential, neurotransmitter, transmitter. This is just a process. Action potential, neurotransmitter release. Neurotransmitters travel across the synapse. Neurotransmitters bind to receptor sites in the dendrite. And then neurotransmitters reuptake. So let's go through this one more time. But in a different scenario. Well, not a different scenario. Just to reiterate. So imagine your brain wants to send a message, like telling your hand to move. And this message starts as an electrical signal inside the neuron. So the next step is it would travel down the axon. So there's an electrical signal. It travels down that long part of the neuron. We call it the axon, and it travels like a lightning bolt. It's fast, like electricity going down a wire. It's very, very fast. The next step is that it reaches that terminal of the axon. So this is when the signal gets to the end of the axon. It reaches the axon terminals. Think of these tiny mail delivery stations at the end of the neuron. And then the next step is where it releases those neurotransmitters. It's where the axon terminals, they release tiny chemicals. And again, we call these chemicals neurotransmitters. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's hopefully will stick by the time you're done listening to this lecture. So don't think that I'm saying something new or thinking, has he said this already? Yes, I am repeating myself on purpose. And so again, the axon terminals release the neurotransmitters. These are messengers. They carry the signal across to the next neuron. The neurotransmitters are then released into that tiny gap between the neurons. That's called the synapse. They cross the synapse, which is the last step. The neurotransmitters float across the synapse to the next neuron. They carry the message with them. Well, that's the last. Then there's the receiving part. So I guess this would be the last step. You also have a transmitter and receiver. So for the new neuron, it would be its first step. It receives a message. So on the other side of the synapse, the next neuron has that special spot. We call these receptors. They catch the neurotransmitters. They're designed to fit only those neurotransmitters. So they're very specific. So when the neurotransmitter, they land on the receptors, they pass that message to the next neuron and they start a brand new electrical signal. So that would be like the first step of the next one. In the meantime, those neurotransmitters are released, let go back into the synapse, and they're ready to be reuptook or reuptaken by the previous neuron. So they deliver the message. They're taken back up into the original neuron to be used again later. So we call this process reuptake, like recycling messengers. So if we summarize all this, the brain sends a message as an electrical signal. Signal travels down the neuron's axon. The transmitters are released into the synapse. They cross that synapse and pass messages to the next neuron. The transmitters are recycled back into the original neuron, and this is how neurons talk to each other and how your brain sends messages to different parts of the body. Again, we're not going to get into any pathologies, but just imagine that any one of these steps not working properly and your signals are not working properly. It's one thing if it's a motor signal where you would have issues controlling a muscle, which is very, very obvious. You can see the effect of that. But imagine one of these neurotransmitters that actually affects your feeling good for the day or your reward system and it's not being released, and how that can affect your mood. So you may be depressed, not sad. You may be depressed and in this mood where you don't know why you're in that mood. You should be happy by every means, every definition of you have everything you need, but you can't shake it off, and that's because these chemical messengers. There's something wrong with that with the transport of that system. I won't say which part because it could be any of those parts. All right. Now let's talk about neurotransmitters specifically, right? The body's chemical messengers. So I said, imagine that your brain is this giant network of roads, and the cars on these roads are messages, and we call those nerve impulses. Hopefully, one of these analogies will stick to you. So these messages, they travel from one place to another, and they help you think, feel, move, right? They help you with your cognitive, your affective, and your behavioral or psychomotor domains. So the first thing is that the nerve impulse reaches that terminal button. And think of the nerve impulse as a car driving down a road. So when this car reaches the end of the road, called the terminal button, it needs to pass a message to another car on a different road. So what happens is there's a release of this neurotransmitter at the end of that road, or the end of that terminal button. Um, the car sends out tiny messengers called neurotransmitters. These are like the people carrying packages of information. They leave the car, they go into a space between roads called the synapse. And within that synapse is like a small parking lot between the roads where the messengers or these neurotransmitters, they wait. And then the neurotransmitters, they fit into very specific receptors. You might think of it like, this might not be the best, but because I'm jumping back to our mailman analogy, the key, right? So these neurotransmitters are actually like keys because they fit a very specific receptor to open up a channel. Um, yeah, so on the other side of that parking lot, that synapse, there's another road that has gates. We'll call the gates receptors, and that fits perfectly with the messengers, and it's like fitting it into a lock. So when the messenger, the neurotransmitter, finds the right gate at that receptor, it delivers its package of information, or it unlocks and delivers that package. So it's a very specific fit. And then you have the receiving dendrites, right? So on the new road, or the next neuron, the new road that receives the message is part of another nerve cell called a dendrite. And once a message is delivered, the nerve impulse continues its journey along the new road. So in biological psychology, this whole process is super important because it's how your brain cell communicates with each other. And it helps you to do everything from, what do we say again? Your cognitive, your affective, and your behavioral domains. Your thinking, your feeling, and your moving, your muscles. When I say behavioral, it's when you act something out. So think of that as muscles. All right. More on neurotransmitters. Here in the slide, we show excitatory and inhibitory. So we have two different types, or two different, let's say, large categories of neurotransmitters. The first one being excitatory neurotransmitters. You can think of excitatory neurotransmitters as a green light or a go signal in traffic. So when these neurotransmitters are released and they fit into those receptors, remember we talked about the lock and key, they tell the next nerve cell to get excited and pass the message along. Like pressing the gas pedal in a car, making that nerve impulse go faster, and it continues its journey. Inhibitory neurotransmitters, kind of like what they sound like, these are like the red light or a stop signal in traffic. So when these neurotransmitters, when they're released and they fit into the receptors, they tell the next nerve cell to slow down or to stop altogether. And it's like pressing the brake pedal in a car, and that makes the nerve cell impulse slow down or even stop completely. So how they work together? The brain uses both these excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters to balance the messages that it sends. It's like, if you remember that game, red light, green light. Yeah, well, that's probably, I realized why I just came up with that game. The game where you all had to stand in line and someone would face the other direction and they would say green light and you would run and try to touch the person. They said red light, they would turn around, and if someone was caught moving, they were out of the game. Well, yeah, I don't know if that actually helps with this, but yeah, I just was reminded of that game. But back to our traffic analogy, right? It's like a big traffic control system where some cars need to go and others need to stop to keep everything running smoothly. But you could probably make an analogy for the people who don't stop, or they're moving too fast. So when the person says red light, turns around and someone's still like moving forward, or because of momentum. I mean, those can actually be used as analogies for certain pathologies in psychology. I'll put some good examples by the time we get to that chapter. So let's talk about an example here. So when you need to react quickly, like you want to catch a ball, you have excitatory neurotransmitters. They speed up the messages to your muscles. And when you need to calm down, like before bed, you have these inhibitory neurotransmitters, and they help slow things down. And why this is important in biological psychology? Because these studies show us how these neurotransmitters affect our thoughts, feelings, behaviors. So if you understand how excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters work, scientists they can learn how our brains control everything we do, and even help find treatments for brain-related issues. So excitatory neurotransmitters are like the gas pedal, speeding things up, and inhibitory neurotransmitters are like the brake pedal, slowing things down. So your brain uses both to keep everything running optimal, just right. It's never really like a full go or full stop. It's more like there's a feedback system that tries to keep everything optimal. Okay, in this slide we're going to talk about agonist and antagonist. You might know the definition of these words, but we're going to talk about them as they're related to drugs. All right, so let's first talk about an agonist drug, right? Just a category of a drug, not any specific drug. Imagine you have a favorite key that opens a special treasure box, right? An agonist drug is like a master key that can also open that treasure box. So in your brain, you have agonist drugs that act like certain neurotransmitters, which are the keys that fit into the receptors, which are the locks to open them. So these drugs sort of like mimic the keys. So when the receptor is opened by the agonist drug, it can make the nerve cell do its job just like the real neurotransmitter would. So for example, if you have a headache and you take pain relievers, the medicine might work as an agonist to help reduce the pain. Now, contrary to the agonist drugs, let's talk about the antagonist drugs. Again, think about a keyhole getting blocked so no one can fit into it. So an antagonist drug is like something that blocks the keyhole so that the real neurotransmitter can't open the treasure box. So in your brain, if you take in an antagonist drug, it blocks the receptors so that neurotransmitters can't fit and do their job. This stops the nerve cell from doing something that it would normally do, like stopping a signal that might cause pain or stress. So for example, if someone is very anxious, they might take a medication that acts as an antagonist to block the signals that would normally make them feel anxious. And how they work together, all of these are back and forth, they work together. It's not good to have one only and not the other. All right, so agonist drugs and antagonist drugs are like these tools, and they can either help you start or stop certain actions in your brains, and they eventually affect behavior. So what scientists will do is they use these drugs to help when their brains aren't working quite right. Well, not theirs. They help people when people's brains aren't working quite right. Not that scientists don't take these medications themselves. So, for instance, if someone's brain is sending too many pain signals, an antagonist drug can help block those signals. And again, and biological psychology is related to this particular chapter. These studies, they show how these drugs affect our brains and behavior. So by understanding how an agonist and antagonist drug work, what scientists will do is they'll develop better treatments for various mental health conditions and other brain-related issues. So agonist drugs are like master keys that open locks, receptors in your brain, and they help signals to pass through, while antagonist drugs are like blockers that prevent the keys from fitting into the locks, stopping signals from passing through. Now, just a quick highlight, I'll try not to go into too many side conversations, and you all have to look this up. But there's studies like where they'll look at the chemicals that are released by jellyfish, for example, right? And people are in great pain because of what jellyfish release, and they study that chemical, how it actually works on a human body, and from that they'll try to figure something that will prevent that. Try to come up with an antagonist for that kind of a drug. So, and we do this a lot. We look at things in nature and we actually look at how we can use it as an agonist or an antagonist, and understanding either how it works or using it to figure out a way to create something that blocks it. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about more in detail the reuptake inhibitor and an enzyme inhibitor. Right? Again, these are drugs that again inhibit the reuptake, and we know what reuptake is of either a neurotransmitter, or in this case, the other one says enzyme inhibitor, so that just means inhibiting an enzyme reuptake. Right? So imagine, let's do an analogy here. Simple analogy. You're at a big party with a lot of balloons, and imagine each one of those balloons is the neurotransmitter. What kind of party would have a lot of balloons? New Year's Eve or your birthday, right? So you have all these balloons, and think of each balloon as a neurotransmitter, a tiny messenger in your brain, right? Normally, after the balloons deliver their messages, they're taken back up to the original balloon, some big giant balloon vendor, which is a balloon seller. It's normally not what we do, but yeah. Imagine you buy balloons for a birthday party, and yay, and then you take the balloons back to the vendor. That could be a nice idea, so we won't pollute the planet too much. You rent balloons, but then you have to take them back. I don't know. But anyway, again, I'm trying not to get into too much of an aside conversation here. So they deliver the message. They're taken back to the balloon vendor to be reused. And we call this reuptake. So a reuptake inhibitor is just what it sounds like. Imagine you have a friendly helper at the party who blocks the balloon vendor from taking back the balloons too quickly because maybe the birthday person wants to play with the balloons more or something, right? So a reuptake inhibitor will keep those balloons there a little bit longer. Not forever, but longer. And so this means that the balloons, which were relating to neurotransmitters, they stay around at the party longer. In the party, we can make the comparison to it being the synapse. And what happens is you keep fun going by delivering more messages because the balloons are there for a much longer period of time. So when we talk about medication and drugs, some medicines for depression are reuptake inhibitors. And what they do is they help keep we'll call them the happy messages, the neurotransmitters in your brain longer, that make you feel better. Now the next one is, hopefully that analogy worked. The next one is enzyme inhibitors, there to your right. Just consider that there's someone at the party who pops the balloons. That's an enzyme, right? And this person reduces the number of balloons that can deliver those happy messages. Happy messages. Imagine that each balloon has confetti. Pop the balloon, confetti just like shoots out. Right, so the enzyme inhibitor, the party pooper at the party, is like a bodyguard who stops the balloon popper from popping too many balloons. Right? So again, balloon popper, making the balloons go through their messages much quicker, right? But the enzyme inhibitor stops that person, slows them down, and so it just means that again you have more balloons or neurotransmitters that stay intact in the synapse or in the party and can keep delivering our messages. Again, that just makes the party continue. Might not be the greatest example, talking about parties, depression, and anxiety medication. Again, do not abuse drugs or medications. Let's talk about Alzheimer's, right? So let's imagine that you have medication for Alzheimer's disease. And some medicines for Alzheimer's disease are enzyme inhibitors, and they help protect the neurotransmitter from being broken down too quickly, which helps the brain work better. So how does all of this work together? So we have both reuptake inhibitors and enzyme inhibitors. They help make sure that the neurotransmitter in your brain can do the job properly. So reuptake inhibitors will make sure that neurotransmitters stay around longer by blocking their reuptake. And enzyme inhibitors protect neurotransmitters from being broken down too quickly. You might remember what an enzyme does from your chemistry class. So this is important in biological psychology because it studies how these inhibitors affect the brain and eventually behavior. So by understanding how reuptake inhibitors and enzyme inhibitors work, what scientists can do is create better treatments for mental health conditions and other brain-related issues. So to summarize, reuptake inhibitors are like helpers who stop the balloons from being taken back too soon. That keeps the party going, making people feel good longer, while enzyme inhibitors are like bodyguards who stop the balloons from being popped. This ensures that there's plenty of balloons still at the party and keeps the party going longer. Um, Again, I hope that analogy works. All right, let's continue with neurotransmitters. We're going to talk about several neurotransmitters. On this page, we're talking about acetylcholine, dopamine, and endorphins. You've probably heard endorphins over and over again. So let's go a little bit into detail into what each one of these are. I'll let you read the slide for yourself. And I'll just try to give you a summary. So again, the three important chemicals, acetylcholine, we abbreviate that capital A, capital C, little h, ACH, dopamine and endorphins. These are all neurotransmitters, which are like, again, the tiny little messengers, and they help your brain and body communicate. So acetylcholine, imagine that you're in a video game where you control a character's movements. Acetylcholine is like the signal that tells your muscles to move when you press the buttons. So it's super important for things like walking, talking, even breathing. Acetylcholine, it also helps with learning and memory. It's like a helpful tool that helps you remember how to play the game better each time. Think of like when you say muscle memory, right? Dopamine, think of dopamine as the feel-good messenger in your brain. When you do something fun like playing your favorite game, eating a delicious snack, or getting a high score, you get this dopamine release. And this makes you feel happy and rewarded. It encourages you to do those things again. Dopamine also helps with movement and coordination. It's kind of how you need good timing to jump over obstacles in the game. When you got that rhythm, you feel good, right? But dopamine, I won't get into too much detail now, but dopamine is the thing. If it's abused, you want too much dopamine release, is what leads to addiction. Right? And so that's why some people will take, I'll call it a drug that actually causes an individual to release dopamine, and it's short-lived, but they feel so good that they want to repeat that over and over again. So dopamine is not something to be played around with. If you use it for developing good habits, let's say you go running, and after you pass a certain milestone, like say you want to get to 3 miles and you can't do it, but you finally get to 3 miles, and you just get this surge of like, I did it, and you get this dopamine release at that point, it feels good, right? And so the next day you want to do it again because you want to feel that rush. But maybe 3 miles isn't doing it anymore. Maybe for the whole first week you are getting that small rush of dopamine, but it's not enough. So you push a little harder. Maybe you increase the time to get to that 3 miles, or you increase the distance to go, and something to get that reward. And so before you know it, you're running marathons. And then it just becomes an addiction. Endorphins, you've heard this, I've heard this over and over as a generic term on TV, right? Endorphins are like your brain's natural painkillers. So when you exercise, when you laugh, or you do something exciting, your brain releases these endorphins. It makes you feel good, but it just relieves stress and pain. So they reduce pain. That'll kind of make you feel good. So you have this feeling, this sensation of feeling good. You kind of feel like you have this boost in your mood. It helps you feel stronger because you're more positive. So endorphins are why you might feel great after a run or a fun time with your friends, right? Because you have a release of endorphins as well. Not to be confused with the dopamine hit, the dopamine rush, because that will also make you feel good. In biological psychology, we study these neurotransmitters and how they affect your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors, right? Your cognitive, your affective, and behavioral, psychomotor. So understanding how acetylcholine, dopamine, endorphin work, this helps scientists learn more about how our brains function and how to help people who might have problems with these chemicals. acetylcholine helping you move and remember things like a controller for your muscles and a memory tool. Dopamine making you feel happy and rewarded, so encourage you to do fun things again. It can also encourage you to do bad things if you get dopamine hits for that. And then endorphins are the natural painkiller that make you feel good and they help reduce pain. This could continue with more neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are extremely interesting. We have a neurotransmitter called GABA. There's a medication that mimics this, GABA aminobutyric acid. I'm sorry. In this slide, it's GABA, glutamate, and serotonin. Serotonin is the other feel-good neurotransmitter. And serotonin is the one you want to keep at good levels in your body regularly. Dopamine is the one that you just want to use sparingly. So I don't know if you want to think of spices, where you may add something, a regular spice on your food, and it's very good for you to have that. And then the other spice, it tastes great, but you want to use it very sparingly. So let's start off with GABA. GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. It functions like a brake system, and it prevents overexcitation of neurons. So when GABA binds to its receptors on a neuron, it typically opens channels that allow chloride ions specifically to enter the neuron, or potassium ions to leave, and it makes it more negative inside and thus less likely to fire an action potential. So chloride ions and potassium ions, you don't have to know too much detail about those, but whenever you see the word ion, it's a molecule that either has too many electrons on its outer valence shells or too few, so it's going to have a charge. It won't be neutral, in other words. It'll be more positive or more negative, and ions can be either. And that's what causes these potentials across the membrane. When we talk about excitatory cells and like electricity traveling to, it's because of those differences in the charges on those chemicals. Really fascinating stuff. So this inhibitory action helps regulate nerve activity, and it maintains balance within the brain, preventing conditions like anxiety, stress, seizures. GABA, it's like benzodiazepines, which are different kinds of drugs. They're often used to treat anxiety disorders because they promote relaxation and they promote calmness. The next one we're going to talk about is glutamate. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. It plays a crucial role in synaptic plasticity, which is essential for learning and memory. So when glutamate binds to its receptors, such as NMDA and AMPA receptors, it usually results in depolarization of neurons, and this makes it more likely to fire an action potential. If you have excessive glutamate activity, that can be harmful, and it's associated with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and other conditions like stroke and epilepsy. So too much excitation can lead to what's called excitotoxicity, and that's where neurons are damaged and they can be killed. So you have to balance glutamate levels, and it's really critical for having a healthy brain function. Serotonin. So I always like to talk about serotonin and dopamine, but your chapter put serotonin here, and it might actually be in alphabetical order. I didn't even think of that. Serotonin and dopamine are like your feel-good neurotransmitters. Serotonin is the one that kind of like sets your base mood, your baseline, and dopamine is the one that causes like your spikes to feel great. So let's just focus on serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, and again, it just contributes to a wide variety of functions in the brain and in the body. It's involved in regulation of mood, which also affects your appetite. It also affects your sleep, memory, your learning. If you don't think that, if people say that your sleep, if you don't get enough sleep, you don't remember things very well, it's because it's all regulated by the same neurotransmitter. Your appetite, your sleep, your memory, your learning. If you're having problems with one, you're probably having problems in the other. And so it may not be the sleep directly, but it would be the serotonin that you might be having a problem with if you can't sleep and you can't remember. So what serotonin does, it can be both excitatory and inhibitory, and it just depends on the type of receptors that it binds to. So in the brain, serotonin is thought to help promote feelings of well-being and happiness. When you have low levels of serotonin, this is associated with depression. So people who are in depression, they have a low baseline of serotonin, and they'll take an antidepressant medication. So antidepressant medications like SSRIs, SSRI just stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, right? We know what that is now. They work by increasing serotonin levels in the brain by selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin. Right? Almost a lot of words there. Yeah. So you inhibit, or basically you slow down the reuptake of serotonin. It stays within the synapse longer. It releases this message, makes those connections with the next neuron, and people don't feel as depressed because the signal's moving through. So at least now you know what an SSRI is. So beyond like mood regulation, serotonin, again, we said it helps you with appetite and digestion. It impacts how we feel hunger and fullness, and it's involved in the functioning of the digestive system. Sometimes you'll see some of those I can't think of the name. The anti-appetite medications. That's not the right term for those medications, but some of them are just serotonin. Serotonin, and the other one is selective SNRI, selective neuro. I can't think of the other one. Starts with an N. Serotonin. I'm at a loss. There's two medications, and they both affect how you feel hungry. And so you may be taking a medication, a serotonin medication, to sort of regulate your appetite. All right. So I'm going to talk about the different types of research and what we call a randomized controlled trial. I'm just going to read these right off the slide. You might already know these. There are things that we focus on in research and things that we try to pay attention to, right? And we have something called the placebo effect. And the placebo effect, again, according to just the definition in the slide, it's our expectations of receiving a treatment can make us feel better or make us experience side effects. There's something called the nocebo effect, which is it's the second part of this actual definition here from your book. The nocebo effect is when you think you're experiencing a bad reaction to a medication when you really got nothing, right? So when you feel negative or you feel bad about taking a placebo, or by taking a sugar pill or whatever they give you, not the actual drug, and you think you're experiencing some side effect because of the medication, we call that the nocebo effect. The placebo effect is when you take it and you think the medication is working and you feel better, but you're actually not feel better, but you think the medication is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And people can actually they can affect their responses to a lot of things within a certain amount, right? So think about the people who take those diet pills and they do these randomized controlled trials, and they talk about people who took the placebo actually did lose weight, but not as much as the people who took the actual drug. So just by believing you're taking something did affect some people's ability to lose weight in those experiments, but not as much as the actual drug. Right? So we have a pretty good influence on our body. The next one is called experimenter bias. So in a randomized controlled trial, we do that to kind of get rid of experimenter bias. And this just means that the researcher's expectations of how a participant should feel or behave can inadvertently influence how the participant feels or behaves. So we try to remove the influence of the researcher on the subject. And then a double-blind study is where both the participants and researchers are blind to conditions. So this is where, a doctor's giving everyone the placebo and the drug, but the doctor themselves don't know who they're giving what to. So the doctor's just as in the dark as the patients are, and so they can't influence the patient with experimenter bias if they don't know themselves if the patient's actually getting the real drug or not. Okay. The takeaways from this section, 3.1. 3.1 was a long section. The central nervous system is the collection of neurons that make up the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is a collection of neurons that link the central nervous system to our skin, muscles, and glands. Neurons are specialized cells found in the nervous system that transmit information. Neurons contain a dendrite, a cell body, and an axon. And the dendrite is like a tree-like extension that receives neurotransmitters from other neurons and transmits electrical stimulation to the cell body. And continue takeaways. The axon is an elongated fiber that sends an electrical signal from the cell body to the axon terminals. Neurotransmitters relay information chemically from the axon terminals across the synapses to receive dendrites. And the many different neurotransmitters work together to influence cognition, memory, and behavior. I think that's the end of this section. I'm going to go ahead and stop it here because it's 50 minutes long, and I'll go ahead and continue with the next section and the next recording. Thank you very much.